Hello, everyone. My name's Andrew Marshall. You might know me from such talks as localizing your Blockly blocks. So I wanted to give a little talk about how, this is actually kind of a repeat talk from last year's VLHCC Blocks and Beyond Summit. But I think these are really important concepts. So everyone in this room has been in the process or is interested in creating Blockly languages, and we think there's a lot of really interesting concerns. And so I'm going to give you some tips, or more accurately, some considerations that you want to keep in mind as you're making your design decisions. So very, very quickly, what is Blockly? It's a framework for building languages that builds the UI and can generate the code text, but it's not a language itself. It is also not an app. Hopefully, most of the people in this room are responsible for the apps. We're just giving you the framework to build that. Having the framework allows you to create the language quickly, and that makes your developers really, really happy that they can get going with blocks that output to, the language of their choice and have their robot or their curriculum running at least very quickly in early prototypes. But are your users happy? So maybe the languages, the design decisions that you make in your language drastically influence the experience that your end users will have. And so we want that to be as good an experience as possible. And so I'm going to give you some guidelines for what to think about when you're making your design decisions. So first of all, what is the age level? What is their reading level? Are they familiar with either Blockly or one of its related apps? At a technical level or a more casual level? Are they approaching this as a tool, as a toy, as a class or a teaching age? Is it a one-time experience, or are they going to have the time to continue learning as they come back to the experience? Are they going to have additional guidance from a teacher? All of these are considerations that are important when you're designing the depth and breadth of your language. So we're going to break down what a block language is into two broad categories. And you've heard the Scratch people refer to block languages in the context of grammar. I'm going to use the term a little bit differently here. But so vocabulary we think of as what is the words, the actual blocks that users have to express themselves in this language. And two, how do those words connect? So this is what we think of as the vocabulary in the grammar. Broadly speaking, we can break down block vocabularies into three big types. We have iconic languages that refer to things in terms of images and representationally. Natural language, which tries to lean on what how the user actually speaks. If they were to, if you were to go through an exercise of maybe you've heard playing the robot and asking a child to tell them how to make a peanut butter sandwich. The vocabulary that they use there is going to be in their natural language. First, pick up the jar. So there's this concept of leaning on their primary language, choose the droid, apply the velocity, is 9 divisible by 3. And then finally, if you're looking to push towards a more technical crowd, maybe you want to lean on technical language or even programming syntax. And all of these can be supported by Blockly. Now, all of these examples here actually come from real Blockly products, or products that are built on Blockly. So in the slide notes are links to where each of these come from, and feel free to ask questions if you have any. So first, on the iconic languages. Iconic languages are excellent for pre-literate users, low literate users, or multicultural audiences. So where language is not something you can necessarily rely on. They're also great for really casual apps where you don't want to feel like you're kind of imposing anything on them. I know the Google teams used this for our coding doodle last December with our little rabbit chasing carrots. Icons have to be recognizable. They're great for tangible and spatial concepts. Parts of your environment or robot, motion, and whether that's rotation or translation or orientation, shapes. All of these are good examples of things that can be very quickly recognized in an iconic format. There's also a few idioms that you might be able to lean on if you know the user's culture. So at the bottom here, we have things for like receiving a message or stop. We're using a stop sign and timers and stoplights. All of these are leaning on assumptions about the user's cultural experience, which may or may not be true depending on how wide an audience you're aiming for. Natural language blocks help eliminate some of the ambiguity by leaning on the words that they're already using in their day-to-day environment. If you can understand, if you can assume that the user is able to read sufficiently. So here we have some really basic examples like move forward by 10, like a random integer. In doing this, you have to be careful about what, let's see, I'm getting ahead of myself. When doing this, you have to be careful about using the right vocabulary level that matches the user's reading skills. Integer might be a foreign word to them. And so, choosing the right number, but words can also be added, used for adding clarification. Move forward by 10 steps or 10 seconds. There is you can expand the word, making it a little bit expand the block, making it a little bit more complicated, but actually clarify what is actually intended by the block. And of course, natural language allows you to lean on localization resources, which I might have talked about a few minutes ago. Technical blocks, using actual code or technical language to describe what the user is doing. So here we have some examples from the Blockly Games Duck Pond that actually use JavaScript and go back and forth between typing the JavaScript and creating blocks with JavaScript. You saw something very similar with the EDU blocks. Also in App Inventor, we see things like click and take picture in camel case, and so these lean upon these concepts that the user is becoming familiar with as they create a more technical artifact. And just because these broad categories are out there, we don't need to like choose just one. We can utilize particularly the iconic methods to help build visual representations or clarify different elements. The center column actually comes from Oslo Blockly, where they have in addition to some text that describes it, a little visual icon of what this actually means to skate in their particular representation. Similarly, we have some 3D printing, 3D design tools that actually allow you to programmatically specify shapes and give you a visual representation of something like what is a torus. Grammars, on the other hand, are how users construct these expressive statements given this plethora of blocks available to them. And so there's two main things that are going on, like what are the connections that each block has, and also what are the parameters that you can apply to each of these blocks. Grammars for iconic languages are generally very, very simple. oftentimes there's one statement for one block and at most one parameter. This is speaking in generalizations of what other people have done. You can try to push this boundary, but you have to make sure that there's a lot of clarity in terms of what each thing means. This is an example from our Code to Snowflake from 2 years ago in the Google Advent calendar. And for example, the repeat block has just a single parameter for how many, and the triangle is just a triangle, but the dropdown actually covers different sizes, not pictured here. And the connections are actually very, very simple. We're just talking about a single sequence, with the exception of the repeat, where we actually are collapsing around a few blocks in this Scratch Junior style. Natural language grammars are often constrained by the grammar of the underlying language. So you can embed blocks and fields in the as fillers for the particular words in the natural language statement. Default values, whether they are field values or shadow blocks, are really, really important to make sure that the block is legible when they first see it in the toolbox and bring it to the workspace. This is what I was saying earlier about adding natural language allows for the possibility of adding clarity. This one move forward by can be represented in a number of different ways. Adding the default value of 10 may clarify that it's not trying to describe a method of movement, but you can go further by actually adding units in the context of what this move forward block means. So there is a range that you're choosing from what is the vocabulary size and the grammar complexity, more or less. This is linear. We want simplification for easier, casual, for younger, one-time users, casual users, first-time users, and possibly transitioning onto more complex blocks as you know that they're going to be repeat users or if they have guidance. Ozoblockly is one that I'll call out here as a really good example of providing different levels for all different users. Ozoblockly.com runs little tabletop Ozobots. Really good example of showing how you can work for a broad range of audiences if you provide different toolboxes. So given this, these are some things that you want to be considering. I'll be open to any questions if you have them.
And just a quick note, we expect most of the people in this room are already thinking about these. This talk is mostly framing how we think about them and the questions we ask when we're talking to a developer and saying, well, how do you think about your blocks? How are you designing them?
Right in front? Or go ahead, Joshua.
Okay. Have you seen any good examples of having like one program with the different three progressions? So having a drop-down box, for example, of an icon, then progressing to like the language and then to
So I called this out a little bit earlier. Ozoblockly does a really good job. They have of providing different vocabularies through different toolboxes. I can actually probably pull it up here very quickly.
And while he pulls it out, Blockly Games also does this to some extent. At levels, the blocks get more and more code-like and more complicated.
So there are a variety of design decisions that they've made here that I wouldn't recommend broadly, but I think they do it's one good approach that we can look at. So if we go to the first level, everything is iconic. They have a couple of numbers, but basically things just look like what they do. As you progress further, we see more text. We still have some icons. The parameterization is just through drop downs, and going further still, we can still see more movement, and now we're actually giving units and allowing math equations to be connected inside, and so we're giving the user more expressivity in creating their language. And all of these work on the same workspace, so they don't have to destroy what they've done before as they decide they're ready to progress. Lisa?
Hi. So this is kind of tangential to what you're talking about, but it touches on something that was brought up yesterday, which is in addition to having language that suits your users' comprehension level, et cetera, it would be like we hard coded the colors on all our blocks to match our hardware, but like to do it for like a lab automation robot or a business application, it also helps to set the colors. I know you can turn down the saturation, but if we could like have a way to put a theme, or maybe that exists and I just haven't found it yet, but like put in a color theme, that would be so awesome.
So I think this is kind of in what we're going towards with the work on color palettes, like be able to have stylizations that can be loaded in at runtime to overlay what is existing in the framework. Whether we are the ones to choose what those themes should be, I'm not sure, but
Define your theme and have it be applied across your blocks or all the blocks that are in one category of a menu, just to make it look so much more professional. I think that would really help to get Blockly used more in a non-educational context.
In the one case that I will kind of go back to my last talk and have you look at the color variables that sit in the string tables. Those do localize where the colors are, so you can apply them for like one variable for an entire category if you use the string references.
Yep. And if you remember back to my talk on where we're going yesterday, we do plan to make the color theming easier. Mm-hmm. Yep. What? Yep. What?
It's actually quite easy to hack. I don't know if I should say this in the recording. It's actually quite easy to hack the color palette, and we could show you how we did it. Because we needed that for the color palette of the underlying application that we build on. They have a very specific design guide, which requires sRGB and all this other stuff. I wouldn't suggest doing that, but if you have to, you can.
And with respect to the RGB stuff, we actually do support it. We just don't really document it very much.
Yeah.
Intentionally.
You can actually do a £sign and a hex value to set color on blocks. Yep. And you can also reference those through the message strings, as Andrew mentioned. The Scratch team, I think, actually has a extension that they run on their blocks to set the theme, all the colors of their blocks. Mm-hmm. So you can get fancy with it. You can do some of those things. It takes a little extra work. We plan to make it easier in the future.
Any other questions on block?
This is actually just a question. Actually, out of pure curiosity, why do you prefer the individual hue value to the RGB value? I mean, to me, RGB just seems so much more intuitive.
Did we need a color talk? I didn't realize this.
So now we're back to questionable design decisions. When I started Blockly, there were quite a few block-based frameworks out there, usually tied to specific products. And in almost every case, they were hideous because they all gave complete freedom, RGB, because that's the easiest. It's the easiest for the programmer. It's easiest for the developer. And if you did a Google search back then for block-based programming language, it was very, very hard to look at. And so I went to a designer at Google and asked, can you give me 8 different colors? Because that's the number I need for starting with the blocks. And I watched the way he worked, he didn't really know what he was doing algorithmically, but I was watching him and I realized that what he was doing was actually just changing the hue while fixing the saturation and color in a roundabout way. Yeah, that's...
We don't want this to be the representation of what Blockly is.
And that is a representation of what block-based programming looked like in the large before Blockly. So I actually think that restricting people to hue, unless they were competent enough to really dig into the code, really helped change the look of block-based programming across the domain. So that I think this is one of those cases where restricting things actually made it better. Now, of course, when you end up with, if you're Scratch, for instance, you've got designers on hand, and you actually want more control, and awesome. But the default, I think, should be designed so that this does not happen.